Welcome back. Now, according to Old Mutual, one of the toughest budgets in years will be presented next week. This as the country's economic recovery efforts are slow in bearing fruit while having to grapple with possible fiscal slippage, warns Old Mutual. Company's Group Chief Economist Johan Els joins us with more insight and analysis as the national budget looms. Thank you so much for your time, Johan. Usually a boring budget is welcome, but seeing that this one won't be so boring, you've described it as a tough budget. What makes it so different?
Well, the biggest problem that we have with our budgets in recent years has been very weak economic growth. So it's very difficult to grow the tax income that government needs. And under those circumstances, when you do have then significant spending pressures, you sit with a big problem. And that's where we are now. And over the past year, we've had huge issues in terms of corporate tax receipts. And of course, that's part of the commodity price cycle in the previous year that was booming in terms of mining taxes. Now we haven't got that. The weak economy further in terms of other tax components under pressure. But then, of course, as we well know, the state-owned enterprises that have significant demands in terms of support from government. And we've had a big adjustment in the medium-term budget policy statement in November, but it seems that tax receipts will be even lower than back then, and there's some extra spending pressures. So, as with our own household budgets, if you run a deficit all the time, your debt keeps on rising, and that's where we sit in South Africa's case.
Johan, keen to get your thoughts here also on the issue of fiscal consolidation. I mean, when we speak of all these pressures, we've been speaking about fiscal consolidation since Tito Mboweni was a finance minister, and we're still speaking about fiscal consolidation. What aren't we getting right?
Well, actually, in terms of the cutting of expenditure, that's been relatively successful in terms of existing current expenditure of government, in terms of setting ceilings for that expenditure and keeping to those ceilings. And then when we run into trouble, cut expenditure again and again. In November, we saw a huge cut in overall expenditure over the medium-term framework again. But then we keep on having extra pressures in terms of the support for SOEs. Now we sit with the issue where Transnet needs some more money. But again, the overarching thing is the weak economic growth, and that makes it difficult on the revenue side, but it also on the spending side. And we've had the expansion of the COVID grants, for instance, because the economy is in a difficult position, because people are unemployed. We need those grants. So had the economy grown better, it would have been both the revenue and the expenditure sides that would have looked a little bit better. So this huge debt, it crowds out other spending. More than 20 cents per 1 rand of revenue we spend on interest payments. And that's something we could have spent elsewhere. Or we could have cut taxes, for instance, or we could have simply reduced the deficit. So there's a number of impacts that significant high interest spending has on the budget. And that's why I say it's very tough. As you asked, the fiscal consolidation, it's been relatively successful, but under these circumstances, there's probably going to be I think the policy is going to be tight. The Minister and Treasury is still going to argue we need strong fiscal consolidation. But against the background, it will probably be a little bit slower than what we need in terms of getting the debt ratio under control.
Yeah, you talk about these extra spending pressures at Transnet, for example, because now if the government doesn't come to the rescue, Transnet will actually be a bigger crisis than Eskom. Has the economic fraternity accepted that government has no choice but to support Transnet, but also maybe working out an effective way in which to support Transnet without maybe getting the balance sheet into too much trouble, maybe taking on debt like they did with Eskom?
Well, a great question, because I think there's a two-pronged answer there. And the first one is, I think we are accepting that we need to give Transnet some money to sort out their issues, because we cannot do without Transnet at this point in time. But there will be very strict, very tight conditionality around any Transnet support. And that's part of that fiscal consolidation. We don't just give money. There must be very strict conditionality, and I think markets are looking to that. But then the other part is that increasing role of the private sector in these logistic functions to do the stuff that Transnet hasn't been able to do. And I think that will accelerate over the next few years, similar to what we've seen in terms of the private sector getting involved in electricity generation. So it's an increasing role of the private sector in the economy. It started off with electricity, it's now going into logistics. It will likely go into other areas. And that's perhaps the positive we can take from the failure of some of these SOEs, is that stronger involvement of the private sector will gradually lift economic growth because it will ease these constraints on the economy.
Yeah, I also want to speak to you about what we heard in the medium-term budget there of the 15 billion rand we're looking for in additional revenue here. It is not a large amount, but it obviously needs to come from somewhere. Where could it realistically come from? With consideration that it is an election year, so the tax issue becomes a bit of a sensitive one, of course. And generally also, there isn't much breathing room for government where revenue is concerned.
Yes, absolutely. But the first one is it's positive that Treasury is focusing on expenditure cutbacks. And I think there's still lots of room for more expenditure cutbacks and not on the revenue side so much. As you say, 15 billion is relatively small. So they realize that you and me as taxpayers, we overtax. Tax rates are high. So they're not going to raise tax rates. And I think it's 15 billion, as you say, it's pretty small, so it's easily going to come from maybe a slight lift in the fuel levy. We haven't seen a fuel levy price increase over the last 2 years, and perhaps less relief for that bracket creep or fiscal drag. When we get a salary increase, we go into a higher tax bracket, so less relief for that. And I think the bulk of that will come from the higher income groups, so that it won't impact the poorer or the lower income earner as significantly. So perhaps there's room for more, but as you say, it's an election year. Perhaps the higher income groups aren't so sensitive if they get significantly less relief for that bracket creep. That's you and me. So at least they're focusing on the expenditure side and not so much on the revenue side because consumers are constrained.
Yeah, we'll see a clearer picture of that next week, Wednesday. Johan, thank you so much for outlining that for us. That was Johan Els, Old Mutual's Group Chief Economist.